Hello there and welcome to Theories Before Sleep. I'm so glad you're here. Maybe it's been a long day, your thoughts still spinning from everything that happened. Perhaps your mind feels crowded, too many voices competing for attention. Or maybe you're simply curious about consciousness itself, seeking something peaceful to carry you into sleep. Tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything but rest. Let your breath slow, your thoughts soften, and your body grow light. We're going to explore 100 theories about the mind's inner universe, not in a rush, but slowly, gently. From the nature of consciousness itself to the mysteries of memory and perception, each theory a quiet doorway into wonder. Some will feel familiar, others strange. All are presented to help you drift peacefully towards sleep. If these explorations help you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now let's begin. The first theory is waiting, patient and quiet. Consciousness emerges from complexity itself. The mind might not be a single thing, but rather what happens when billions of simple processes interact. This theory suggests consciousness emerges from complexity, the way a symphony emerges from individual instruments, each neuron contributing its small voice to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. No single cell in your brain is conscious, yet together they generate the rich inner world you experience every moment. The transition from unconscious matter to conscious experience remains mysterious. But emergence offers one explanation, that new properties can arise when systems reach certain thresholds of complexity and integration. Your thoughts, feelings, and sense of self might be emergent phenomena, patterns that exist only at the level of the whole, impossible to locate in any single component. This theory suggests consciousness is not separate from the physical brain, but is what the brain does when it achieves sufficient complexity, like how wetness emerges from water molecules without existing in any single molecule alone. The mind creates reality through prediction. Your brain might not passively receive reality, but actively construct it through constant prediction. This theory, supported by neuroscience research, proposes that perception works backward. Your mind generates expectations about what should be there, then updates these predictions based on incoming sensory data. What you experience as reality is actually your brain's best guess about the world, refined moment by moment through prediction errors. The raw sensory information flooding your nervous system is ambiguous and incomplete, so your mind fills in gaps, makes assumptions, creates coherence where there might be chaos. This means you never perceive the world directly, but always through the filter of your expectations, shaped by past experience and current context. The theory explains many perceptual illusions and why two people can witness the same event yet remember it differently. Your consciousness might be a controlled hallucination, constrained by reality but never quite touching it, forever separated by the predictions your mind cannot help but make. Consciousness exists on a spectrum, without clear boundaries. Awareness might not be something you either have or don't have, but rather exist along a continuous spectrum. This theory challenges the binary view of consciousness, suggesting that all matter possesses some degree of experience, from the rich inner life of humans to the dim awareness of simpler organisms to perhaps even the faint proto-consciousness of individual cells. The difference between your consciousness and that of other beings would be one of degree rather than kind, a gradual dimming rather than an absolute threshold. This perspective, sometimes called panpsychism, proposes that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality that becomes more complex and integrated as systems become more sophisticated. A bacteria might have minimal awareness, a dog more, a human vastly more, but all would share the basic property of experience. The theory avoids the hard problem of how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter by suggesting it never does. It's already there, waiting to be organized into more complex forms through evolution and development. Memory is reconstructed. Each time you remember, your memories might not be stored like files in a computer, but recreated anew each time you recall them. This theory, well supported by memory research, suggests that remembering is an active process of reconstruction rather than passive retrieval. Each time you access a memory, your brain rebuilds it from fragments scattered across different neural networks, and in the process the memory can change, incorporating new information, current emotions, and present context. This means your past is not fixed but fluid, constantly being rewritten by the act of remembering itself. The memory you have of childhood events has been reconstructed countless times, each reconstruction potentially altering details, adding elements, removing others, until what you remember might bear only loose resemblance to what actually happened. This theory explains why eyewitness testimony can be unreliable, and why siblings often remember the same events differently. Your personal history exists not as a stable record, but as a living story, forever being retold, forever changing in subtle ways you cannot detect or control. The self is an illusion created by the brain. What you think of as yourself might not actually exist as a unified entity. This theory, explored extensively in neuroscience and Buddhist philosophy, proposes that the feeling of being a coherent, continuous self is a useful fiction created by your brain to make sense of disparate mental processes. There is no central location in the brain where consciousness resides, no homunculus watching the show. Instead, many separate processes run in parallel, and your brain weaves them together into a narrative of unified experience. The self is more like a story your brain tells itself, a convenient way to organize information and make decisions, but not a real thing that exists independently. Brain damage can fragment this illusion, revealing how the self can be divided or altered when neural connections change. This theory suggests that the boundary between you and not you is arbitrary, that consciousness is more like a process than a thing, more like a verb than a noun, constantly flowing and changing while maintaining the illusion of stability and permanence. Attention creates your conscious experience. Only what you pay attention to becomes conscious, while the rest remains in darkness. This theory proposes that consciousness is not a general state, but a spotlight that illuminates only a tiny fraction of the information your brain processes each moment. Your mind handles vast amounts of data, visual input, sounds, bodily sensations, memories, thoughts, but most of it never reaches awareness. Attention selects what becomes conscious, bringing certain information into the light while leaving everything else in shadow. This means the contents of your consciousness are determined not just by what exists in the world, but by where your attention happens to be directed. You can look directly at something yet not see it if your attention is elsewhere, a phenomenon demonstrated by studies of inattentional blindness. The theory suggests consciousness might be less mysterious than it seems. Perhaps it is simply whatever information is currently being broadcast to multiple brain systems for processing and integration. Your subjective experience would then be defined by what your attention selects from the constant stream of neural activity flowing through your mind. Dreams are the brain processing emotions. Your dreams might serve as emotional therapy, helping your mind process feelings from waking life. This theory suggests that during sleep, particularly during REM periods, your brain reactivates emotional memories and works through them in the safe space of dreams, stripping away some of their intensity while preserving the important lessons they contain. The bizarre, symbolic nature of dreams might reflect the brain's attempt to find patterns and connections between different emotional experiences, creating new associations and insights. This processing happens without the constraints of logic or reality, allowing your mind to explore emotional landscapes more freely than waking thought permits. The theory explains why dreams often feature emotionally significant people and situations, why they can feel so intense yet fade quickly upon waking, and why dream deprivation can lead to emotional difficulties. Your sleeping mind might be doing important psychological work, integrating experiences, resolving conflicts, and preparing you emotionally for the challenges ahead. Dreams would be less about predicting the future or revealing hidden truths than about maintaining emotional balance, a nightly reset that keeps your inner world functioning smoothly. Consciousness requires integration of information. Awareness might emerge when information becomes highly integrated across the brain. This theory, called integrated information theory, proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information a system generates. A collection of separate parts, even if individually complex, would not be conscious if they don't interact and integrate their information. But when parts become highly interconnected, sharing and combining information in rich ways, consciousness emerges. The theory suggests consciousness is not all or nothing, but exists in degrees, proportional to the amount of integrated information present. A brain generates high levels of integrated information because its billions of neurons are densely interconnected, constantly influencing each other in complex patterns. This would explain why consciousness fades during deep sleep, when neural activity becomes more isolated and less integrated, and why certain brain structures contribute more to consciousness than others. The theory offers a mathematical framework for measuring consciousness, suggesting it might eventually be quantified. Your subjective experience would reflect the particular pattern of information integration happening in your brain at each moment, unique and irreducible to simpler components. The mind extends beyond the brain. Into the body, consciousness might not be confined to your skull, but distributed throughout your entire body. This theory, called embodied cognition, proposes that your mind is not separate from your body but deeply intertwined with it, shaped by physical sensations, movements, and the constant flow of information between brain and body. The way you think is influenced by your posture, your gestures, your heartbeat, your gut. Your body is not just a vehicle for the brain, but an integral part of the cognitive system itself. This means changing your body changes your mind. Standing in a confident pose can make you feel more confident, smiling can improve your mood, and physical exercise can alter thought patterns. The theory challenges the traditional view of mind as purely neural, suggesting instead that consciousness emerges from the dynamic interaction of brain, body, and environment. Your sense of self includes bodily awareness, and damage to this connection can lead to strange experiences like feeling detached from your own body or failing to recognize your own limbs. The boundary of your mind might extend to your skin and perhaps beyond, into the tools you use and the spaces you inhabit. Free will might be an illusion of timing. Your sense of choosing freely might arise from a timing trick in the brain. Research has shown that brain activity associated with a decision begins before you become consciously aware of making that decision, sometimes by several seconds. This suggests that your unconscious mind might be making choices before your conscious mind knows about them, with consciousness arriving late to the party and claiming credit for decisions already made. The feeling of free will would then be a retrospective illusion, your mind telling itself a story about choosing when the choice was already determined by neural processes outside awareness. This theory doesn't necessarily mean you have no control over your actions, but it suggests that the conscious experience of willing something to happen might not be what actually causes it to happen. Your decisions might emerge from complex interactions of unconscious processes, with consciousness simply narrating the outcome. The theory raises profound questions about moral responsibility and the nature of agency, suggesting that the intuitive sense of being a free chooser might be one more story your brain tells itself to make sense of its own operations. Consciousness might be what it feels like to be information processing itself, not something separate from computation, but the subjective experience of certain types of information flow. This theory proposes that when information is processed in particular ways, integrated, recursive, self-referential, it generates consciousness as an intrinsic property. The processing doesn't just correlate with consciousness, it is consciousness viewed from the inside. This would mean that consciousness is not a mysterious extra ingredient added to physical processes, but rather what those processes are like from a first-person perspective. A sufficiently complex computer might be conscious if it processes information in the right way, not because consciousness is somehow uploaded into it, but because information processing of that type simply is consciousness. The theory bridges the gap between objective brain activity and subjective experience by suggesting they are two aspects of the same thing. Like how a coin has both heads and tails, your thoughts, feelings, and sensations would be what certain patterns of neural information processing feel like from within, the inner face of physical processes that can also be described from the outside in terms of neurons and synapses. The mind might construct time rather than experience it as an objective feature of reality. This theory suggests that your sense of time flowing from past through present to future is created by how your brain organizes information, not by time itself having any inherent direction or flow. Memory creates the past by storing information about previous states, and anticipation creates the future by generating predictions about upcoming states. But the present moment might be an illusion, a construct with no clear boundary. Neuroscience shows that the brain integrates information over brief windows, creating the impression of a continuous now that actually spans several hundred milliseconds. Events that happen within this window seem simultaneous even if they're not, and the order of events can be misperceived or reversed. This means your experience of time is flexible, constructed, and sometimes inaccurate. Time can seem to slow during intense experiences or speed up during routine activities, not because time itself changes, but because your brain processes information differently in different contexts. The theory suggests that the flow of time might be a feature of consciousness, rather than consciousness being a feature that exists in time, inverting the usual relationship. Emotions might be the brain's way of creating meaning and value in a meaningless universe. This theory proposes that emotions are not just reactions to events, but active interpretations that assign significance to otherwise neutral information. Your brain constantly evaluates situations based on their relevance to your survival, goals, and well-being, and emotions are the felt experience of these evaluations. Fear tells you something is dangerous. Joy tells you something is beneficial. Sadness tells you something valuable has been lost. Without emotions, you would perceive the world but find nothing in it meaningful or important. Everything would be mere facts, devoid of significance. The theory suggests emotions are not opposed to rationality, but essential for it, providing the value judgments that make decision-making possible. A purely logical being without emotions would have no reason to do anything rather than nothing, no basis for preferring one outcome over another. Your emotional life might be what makes your consciousness feel like something rather than nothing, what transforms abstract information into lived experience. The richness of human consciousness might depend fundamentally on the capacity to feel, to care, to find meaning in the flow of events. The unconscious mind might be far larger and more powerful than consciousness, with awareness being just a tiny island in a vast dark ocean. This theory suggests that most of your mental life happens outside awareness, with consciousness accessing only a small fraction of the brain's activity. Your unconscious processes handle perception, memory retrieval, language comprehension, emotional responses, and countless other functions without any need for conscious attention. Consciousness might exist primarily to handle novel situations and complex decisions that require flexible thinking, while the unconscious handles everything routine and automatic. This would explain why you can perform complex tasks like driving while thinking about something else, why solutions to problems sometimes appear suddenly without conscious effort, and why you can't introspect into how your mind actually works. The theory suggests that consciousness is less like a ruler controlling the mind, and more like a spokesperson, aware of some outcomes but not the processes that produce them. Your sense of being in control might be partly illusory, with unconscious processes doing most of the work while consciousness takes credit and maintains the narrative of a unified self making deliberate choices. Language might shape thought in fundamental ways, making some ideas easy to think and others nearly impossible. This theory, related to linguistic relativity, proposes that the language you speak influences how you perceive and conceptualize reality. Different languages carve up the world differently, with some making distinctions that others ignore and vice versa. The words and grammatical structures available to you might constrain what thoughts you can easily entertain, like how a painter's palette limits what colours can appear in the painting. Some languages force speakers to always indicate direction or time in ways English doesn't, potentially making speakers more attentive to these features of experience. Other languages lack words for concepts common in English, potentially making those concepts harder to think about. The theory doesn't suggest language completely determines thought, but it influences it, creating cognitive habits and making certain patterns of thinking more natural than others. Your inner monologue, the voice of consciousness itself, might be shaped by the linguistic structures you've internalized. The theory suggests that learning new languages might literally expand your mind, making new ways of thinking possible. Consciousness might have levels or layers, with different types of awareness operating simultaneously. This theory proposes that your mind contains multiple levels of consciousness, from basic sensory awareness to self-reflective thought, each operating according to different principles. The lowest level might be simple awareness of sensations, present even in simple organisms. Higher levels include awareness of emotions, of thoughts, of being a self, and at the highest level, awareness of being aware, meta-consciousness. These levels might not be strictly hierarchical but interconnected, with higher levels emerging from but not reducible to lower ones. The theory suggests that different mental states emphasize different levels. During meditation, lower levels of pure awareness might dominate, while during analytical thinking, higher levels of reflective consciousness come to the fore. Brain damage or altered states can selectively affect different levels, suggesting they have distinct neural bases. Your normal waking consciousness might involve all levels operating together, creating the rich, multifaceted experience of being you. The theory offers a framework for understanding how consciousness can be both unified and diverse, both simple and complex, both immediate and reflective all at once. The mind might create a model of itself, and consciousness is what it's like to be that model. This theory suggests that your brain builds an internal representation of your own mental states, a model that tracks what you're thinking, feeling, and perceiving. Consciousness would be the experience of this self-model, what it feels like from the inside to be a system that represents its own states to itself. The model is necessarily incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, but it's useful for planning, communicating, and coordinating complex behavior. When you think about your own thoughts or feelings, you're accessing this self-model, not the actual underlying processes. This explains why introspection can be misleading. You're examining a simplified representation, not the full reality of your mental machinery. The theory suggests that consciousness requires a certain kind of recursive self-representation, where the system models itself, modeling itself, creating loops of self-reference. This self-modeling might be what gives rise to the sense of being a subject, an experiencer, a self that persists through time. Without the ability to represent your own mental states, you might process information without being conscious of doing so, like a sophisticated zombie. Attention might be limited because consciousness requires energy, and the brain must allocate resources carefully. This theory proposes that conscious processing is metabolically expensive, requiring significant neural resources, so the brain can only make a small amount of information conscious at any given time. Most processing happens unconsciously because it's more efficient, with consciousness reserved for tasks that truly need its special properties: flexibility, integration, and deliberate control. The limited capacity of attention would reflect genuine physical constraints, not arbitrary design. This explains why multitasking is difficult, why concentration requires effort, and why mental fatigue feels similar to physical fatigue. Your brain is constantly making cost-benefit calculations, deciding what information is important enough to warrant the expense of conscious processing. The theory suggests that consciousness is not just a passive observer, but an active, resource-intensive process that the brain deploys strategically. When you feel mentally exhausted, it might be because you've depleted the resources needed for sustained conscious attention. Like a muscle that tires after prolonged use, the subjective effort of thinking might reflect real metabolic costs, consciousness burning energy to maintain its illuminating spotlight. Consciousness might be discontinuous, with gaps and breaks that are hidden by the brain's storytelling. This theory suggests that awareness is not a continuous stream, but a series of discrete moments, like frames in a film that create the illusion of smooth motion. The brain might sample the world periodically rather than continuously, with consciousness arising in brief pulses separated by tiny gaps you never notice. These gaps would be invisible because the brain fills them in, creating a seamless narrative of continuous experience. The theory is supported by findings that perception has a temporal resolution, a shortest interval below which events blur together. Your sense of the present moment might actually span a brief window during which the brain integrates information, creating the illusion of simultaneity for events that happen at slightly different times. This would mean consciousness is more like a series of snapshots than a movie, with your mind stitching the snapshots together so skillfully that you never notice the seams. The continuity of consciousness might be one more illusion, a story the brain tells itself to make sense of its own discrete, punctuated operation. The mind might use metaphors to understand abstract concepts, grounding them in physical experience. This theory proposes that much of human thought, especially about abstract domains, relies on metaphorical mappings from concrete bodily experience. You understand time in terms of space, moving through time like moving through physical locations. You understand emotions in terms of forces, being overwhelmed or uplifted or crushed by feelings. These metaphors are not just linguistic decorations, but fundamental to how concepts are structured in your mind. The theory suggests that consciousness is inherently embodied, shaped by the kind of body you have and the physical environment you navigate. Your abstract thoughts about mathematics, morality, or philosophy might all be built on metaphorical extensions of basic bodily experiences like containment, motion, and balance. This would mean that beings with different bodies might think differently, not just about physical matters, but about everything, because their conceptual metaphors would be grounded in different physical experiences. The theory offers an explanation for why certain ideas feel intuitive, while others feel abstract and difficult. Intuitive ideas align with metaphorical mappings from bodily experience, while difficult ideas require novel or strained metaphors. Consciousness might arise from quantum processes in the brain, operating at scales far smaller than neurons. This theory, though controversial, proposes that quantum effects in cellular structures called microtubules might be essential for consciousness. These tiny structures inside neurons could maintain quantum coherence long enough to influence neural processing, potentially explaining how the brain integrates information so effectively. Quantum superposition might allow the brain to process multiple possibilities simultaneously, before collapsing into a single conscious experience. The theory suggests that consciousness requires quantum mechanics, not just classical physics, to fully explain. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive, but proponents point to evidence of quantum effects in biological systems like photosynthesis. If true, this theory would mean consciousness is fundamentally quantum, irreducible to classical computation. Your thoughts might involve quantum indeterminacy, with decisions remaining in superposition until the moment of conscious choice. The theory remains speculative, difficult to test, and widely debated, but it offers a radical possibility. that consciousness might require physics beyond what classical neuroscience assumes, operating at the strange boundary where quantum and classical worlds meet. Your sense of self might be constructed from narrative, a story your mind tells about who you are. This theory proposes that the self is not a fixed entity, but an ongoing narrative, constantly being written and revised as you move through life. You understand yourself through stories, where you came from, what you've done, what you value, where you're going. These stories create coherence and continuity, linking past, present, and future into a single identity. But the narrative is selective, emphasizing some events while forgetting others, interpreting ambiguous experiences in ways that fit the overall story. This means your sense of self is partly fictional, shaped by the stories you tell yourself and others. The theory explains why identity can change over time, why memory is reconstructive, and why different people can remember shared experiences differently. Each person constructs their own narrative, their own version of events, their own interpretation of who they are. Your consciousness might be inseparable from this narrative process, with self-awareness requiring the ability to tell stories about yourself. Without narrative, there might be experience but no experiencer, sensations but no self to whom they belong, a stream of consciousness without a sense of being someone to whom it all happens. The mind might be a prediction machine, constantly generating expectations and updating them based on sensory input. This theory, called predictive processing, proposes that the brain's primary function is not to represent the world accurately, but to minimize prediction errors. Your brain generates models of what should happen next, compares these predictions to actual sensory data, and updates the models when mismatches occur. Consciousness might be the experience of this ongoing prediction and error correction process, with surprising or unpredicted events capturing attention, while predicted events fade into the background. The theory explains many perceptual phenomena: why you can't tickle yourself, your brain predicts the sensation, why optical illusions work, predictions override sensory data, and why attention is drawn to novelty, prediction errors signal important information. Your entire experience of reality might be a controlled hallucination, a model generated by your brain and constrained but not determined by sensory input. The world you perceive is not the world as it is, but the world as your brain predicts it to be, updated moment by moment as new information arrives. This theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally predictive, always leaning into the future, always anticipating what comes next. Consciousness might require a certain kind of neural architecture, with specific patterns of connectivity. This theory proposes that not all information processing generates consciousness. Only processing that occurs in systems with particular structural properties. The brain's architecture, its patterns of connections, feedback loops and hierarchical organization might be essential for consciousness to arise. Simply having many neurons isn't enough. They must be connected in specific ways that allow for integration, recursion, and global broadcasting of information. The theory suggests that consciousness depends on the brain's large-scale organization, not just local neural activity. Damage to certain brain regions disrupts consciousness, more than damage to others, suggesting that some structures are more critical for awareness. The thalamus, for instance, might act as a hub that integrates information across the cortex, and damage to it can eliminate consciousness even when cortical areas remain active. The theory implies that consciousness is not substrate independent, that you couldn't create it just by implementing the right algorithm on any hardware. The physical structure matters, the way components are arranged and connected matters, because consciousness might emerge from architectural properties that can't be captured by function alone. Emotions might be predictions about bodily states, not direct readouts of what the body is doing. This theory proposes that emotional feelings arise when the brain predicts changes in the body and generates the corresponding sensations before the body actually changes. You feel afraid before your heart races, not because of it, with the racing heart coming later as a response to the brain's prediction. This inverts the traditional view that emotions are caused by bodily changes. Instead, the brain anticipates bodily states based on context and past experience, creating emotional feelings that then trigger actual bodily responses. The theory suggests that emotions are constructed, not hardwired, with your brain learning through experience what bodily states are appropriate for different situations. This explains why emotions can vary across cultures and individuals, why emotional responses can be modified through learning, and why thinking about emotional situations can produce physical sensations even without external stimuli. Your emotional life would be largely predictive, your brain constantly simulating bodily states and generating feelings based on these simulations. The richness of emotional experience might reflect the complexity of these predictions, the subtle variations in simulated bodily states that your brain generates in response to an ever-changing world. The mind might be fundamentally social, shaped by interactions with other minds. This theory proposes that consciousness as humans experience it requires social context, developing through relationships and communication. Your sense of self might emerge from seeing yourself reflected in others' responses, learning who you are through social interaction. Language, culture, and shared understanding might be essential scaffolding for human consciousness, not just add-ons to an already conscious mind. Children raised in isolation show profound deficits in cognitive and emotional development, suggesting that normal consciousness requires social input. The theory suggests that your mind is not contained within your skull, but extends into the social world, shaped by and dependent on interactions with other minds. Even your private thoughts might be internalized versions of social dialogue, conversations you've had or imagined having with others. The boundary between individual and social consciousness might be blurry, with your sense of self being partly a social construction, maintained through ongoing relationships and communication. This theory implies that consciousness is not just a property of individual brains, but emerges from networks of interacting minds, each shaping and being shaped by the others in a continuous social dance. Consciousness might fade in and out, rather than being constantly present during waking hours. This theory suggests that you're not always conscious in the same way or to the same degree, with awareness varying continuously based on attention, arousal, and mental state. Sometimes you're highly conscious, fully engaged and aware. Other times you're on autopilot, performing actions with minimal awareness, your mind wandering or nearly blank. These fluctuations might happen constantly throughout the day, with consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide. The theory challenges the assumption that waking means being conscious, suggesting instead that waking contains many gradations of consciousness, from full awareness to states barely distinguishable from sleep. You might spend significant portions of your day in reduced states of consciousness, functioning adequately but not fully aware. This would explain why time sometimes seems to pass without notice, why you can arrive somewhere with no memory of the journey, and why attention and awareness feel effortful to maintain. Consciousness might require active maintenance, with the default state being something less than full awareness. The theory suggests that consciousness is not a binary property but a continuum, with most of your waking life spent somewhere in the middle range rather than at the peak of awareness. The mind might create a sense of presence, of being here now, that is distinct from sensory experience. This theory proposes that consciousness includes not just perceptions and thoughts, but a fundamental sense of presence, of existing in a particular place and time. This presence is not reducible to sensory input, but is a separate quality of experience, the felt sense of being somewhere. The theory suggests that presence requires integration of multiple sensory modalities, bodily awareness, and spatial cognition, creating a unified sense of being located in space. Disruptions to this integration can create strange experiences like out-of-body sensations or feelings of unreality. Virtual reality research shows that presence can be manipulated by controlling sensory input, suggesting it's constructed by the brain rather than directly perceived. Your sense of being here, in this moment, in this place, might be one more creation of consciousness, a model of your location in space and time that usually aligns with reality but can occasionally drift or distort. The theory suggests that presence is essential to normal consciousness, that being aware requires being aware from somewhere, that consciousness is always situated, always embedded in a particular perspective. Without presence, there might be thoughts and perceptions but no sense of a place from which they're experienced. Consciousness might be a workspace where different brain processes compete for access. This theory, called global workspace theory, proposes that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to multiple brain systems simultaneously. Most neural processing happens in specialized modules that work independently and unconsciously. But when information needs to be shared across modules, when different systems need to coordinate, it enters a global workspace where it becomes conscious. Consciousness would be the brain's way of broadcasting important information to all systems at once, allowing flexible responses to novel situations. The theory explains why consciousness has limited capacity. Only one piece of information at a time can be globally broadcast. It also explains why consciousness seems unified despite the brain's modular organization. The workspace integrates information from different sources into a single coherent experience. Your conscious experience at any moment would reflect whatever information has won the competition for global access, with unconscious processes constantly vying to enter the workspace. The theory suggests consciousness is not a special substance or mysterious property, but simply what it's like when information becomes globally available in the brain, accessible to memory, planning, language, and action systems all at once. The mind might construct a body image that can diverge from the actual body. This theory proposes that your brain maintains an internal model of your body, its size, shape, and position. And this model is what you experience as your body, not the body itself. Usually the model aligns well with reality, but it can be distorted by injury, illness, or experimental manipulation. Phantom limbs demonstrate how the body image can include parts that no longer exist, with amputees feeling sensations in missing limbs because the brain's model hasn't updated. The rubber hand illusion shows how the body image can be extended to include external objects, with people feeling touch on a fake hand as if it were their own. The theory suggests that your sense of embodiment, of having and being a body, is constructed by the brain and can be surprisingly flexible. Disorders like anorexia might involve distortions of body image, with the internal model not matching the actual body. Your consciousness includes not just thoughts and perceptions, but a felt sense of embodiment, of being located in and identified with a particular body. This sense is usually so stable that it feels like direct awareness, but the theory reveals it as one more construction, one more model the brain creates to navigate the world. Consciousness might require recurrent processing, with information flowing both up and down neural hierarchies. This theory proposes that consciousness arises not from simple feed-forward processing, but from complex loops where information cycles through the brain multiple times. Sensory information flows up from receptors to higher processing areas, but simultaneously predictions and expectations flow down from higher areas to lower ones. Consciousness might emerge from the interaction of these ascending and descending streams, from the dialogue between bottom-up sensory data and top-down predictions. The theory explains why consciousness takes time. It requires multiple cycles of processing, not just a single pass through the system. It also explains why attention affects perception. Attention modulates the recurrent loops, strengthening some signals and suppressing others. Your conscious experience at any moment would reflect the state of these recurrent processes, the ongoing negotiation between what the world is sending in and what your brain expects to find. The theory suggests that consciousness is inherently dynamic, never static, always involving feedback and iteration. A purely feed-forward system, no matter how complex, might process information without being conscious, lacking the recursive loops that create awareness. The mind might be capable of multiple simultaneous streams of consciousness under certain conditions. This theory challenges the assumption that consciousness is always unified, suggesting instead that under some circumstances, separate streams of awareness can coexist in the same brain. Split-brain patients, whose corpus callosum has been severed, sometimes show evidence of two independent conscious systems, each unaware of the other. During certain tasks, the left and right hemispheres can pursue different goals and make different choices, suggesting two separate centers of consciousness. The theory raises profound questions about the unity of self. If consciousness can be split, what makes you one person rather than many? Even in normal brains, some researchers suggest that consciousness might be less unified than it seems, with different processes operating semi-independently and only loosely coordinated. Your sense of being a single unified self might be an illusion maintained by constant communication between brain regions. But when that communication is disrupted, the illusion can break down. The theory suggests that the unity of consciousness is an achievement, not a given, something the brain must actively maintain through integration and coordination. Consciousness might involve a sense of ownership, of experiences being mine rather than someone else's. This theory proposes that consciousness includes not just experiences, but a fundamental sense that these experiences belong to you, that you are the one having them. This sense of ownership is distinct from the content of experience itself and can be disrupted in certain conditions, leading to strange feelings that thoughts or actions aren't really yours. Some psychiatric disorders involve disturbances of ownership, with patients feeling that their thoughts are inserted by others or that their actions are controlled externally. The theory suggests that ownership requires the brain to tag experiences with a self-reference, marking them as belonging to this particular system. This tagging might involve specific neural processes that can be selectively damaged or disrupted. Your sense of being the owner of your experiences, of being the subject to whom consciousness happens, might be one more constructed feature rather than an intrinsic property of awareness. The theory raises questions about what it would be like to have experiences without ownership, to be aware without being aware that you are aware, to have thoughts without feeling that they are your thoughts. The mind might create meaning by connecting information to emotional and motivational systems. This theory proposes that consciousness is not just about processing information, but about caring about it, finding it significant. The same information can be processed unconsciously without generating meaning, but when it connects to emotional and motivational systems, it becomes meaningful and conscious. Meaning would not be an inherent property of information, but something created by its relationship to your goals, values, and concerns. The theory explains why some information captures attention while other information is ignored. Meaningful information is prioritized for conscious processing. It also explains why consciousness feels like something rather than being empty computation, because conscious information is always connected to effect, always mattering in some way. Your conscious experience might be fundamentally evaluative, always colored by subtle feelings of good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, important or trivial. These evaluative dimensions might be essential to consciousness, not optional features that could be removed while leaving awareness intact. The theory suggests that consciousness is inherently subjective, not just in the sense of being private, but in the sense of involving a point of view that cares about what it experiences. Consciousness might be a recent evolutionary development, not present in all organisms with nervous systems. This theory proposes that consciousness emerged relatively late in evolutionary history, perhaps only in vertebrates or even only in mammals and birds. Simpler organisms might process information and respond to their environment without any subjective experience, operating as sophisticated but unconscious biological machines. The theory suggests that consciousness required specific neural innovations, perhaps related to brain size, connectivity, or architectural features that evolved only in certain lineages. This would mean that consciousness is not a fundamental feature of life, but a specialized adaptation that provides certain advantages. The advantages might include flexibility, the ability to simulate possible futures, or enhanced learning and memory. The theory is controversial because it's difficult to determine which organisms are conscious, but it suggests that consciousness has a history, that there was a time when no organism was conscious, and a moment when consciousness first appeared. Your consciousness would be the product of millions of years of evolution, a recent innovation in the grand sweep of life on Earth, something that might not exist elsewhere in the universe if the right conditions haven't been met. The mind might construct time perception differently for different types of events. This theory proposes that your sense of time is not uniform but varies depending on what you're experiencing, with emotional events seeming to last longer than neutral ones, novel events seeming longer than familiar ones, and retrospective time, remembering duration, differing from prospective time, experiencing duration. The brain might use different mechanisms to estimate time for different purposes, with no single clock governing all temporal experience. This would explain why time seems to slow during accidents or other intense experiences. Emotional arousal affects time perception, making brief events feel extended. It would also explain why time seems to accelerate as you age. Fewer novel experiences mean fewer rich memories, making periods of time seem shorter in retrospect. The theory suggests that consciousness doesn't experience time directly, but constructs it from various cues and heuristics, creating a sense of duration that can be systematically distorted. Your temporal experience might be one more illusion, a useful fiction that helps you navigate the world but doesn't correspond to any objective temporal reality. Time as you experience it might be a feature of consciousness, not a feature of the universe that consciousness simply perceives. Consciousness might require a distinction between self and world, a boundary that separates inner from outer. This theory proposes that awareness requires the brain to maintain a model of what is self and what is not self, creating a boundary that might not correspond to any physical edge. This boundary is usually placed at the skin, but it can be flexible, extending to include tools you're using or contracting to exclude parts of your own body that feel alien. The theory suggests that consciousness is inherently perspectival, always from a particular point of view that distinguishes subject from object. Without this distinction, there might be experience but no experiencer, sensations but no sense of a self to whom they belong. The boundary between self and world might be one of the fundamental features of consciousness, present in some form in all conscious organisms. Disorders that blur this boundary can lead to strange experiences like feeling merged with the environment or unable to distinguish thoughts from external voices. Your sense of being a separate individual distinct from the world around you might be a constructed feature of consciousness, maintained by neural processes that can be disrupted or altered, revealing the boundary to be less absolute than it ordinarily seems. The mind might be shaped by culture in deep ways, not just in content but in structure. This theory proposes that different cultures might cultivate different forms of consciousness, with variations in how attention is deployed, how the self is conceived, and how emotions are experienced. Western cultures tend to emphasize individual autonomy and analytic thinking, while Eastern cultures often emphasize social harmony and holistic thinking. These differences might not just be about what people think, but about how they think, affecting basic cognitive processes and the structure of conscious experience. The theory suggests that consciousness is not purely biological but partly cultural, shaped by language, practices, and social structures. Your way of being conscious might differ from someone raised in a different culture, not just in superficial ways but in fundamental aspects of experience. The theory challenges the assumption that consciousness has a single universal form, suggesting instead that there might be multiple varieties of human consciousness, each shaped by different cultural contexts. This doesn't mean consciousness is entirely relative or arbitrary. but it suggests that culture provides frameworks within which consciousness develops, shaping it in ways that might not be immediately obvious, but that affect experience at a deep level. Consciousness might involve a sense of agency, of being able to cause things to happen. This theory proposes that awareness includes not just passive observation, but a sense of being able to act, to make things happen through will or intention. This sense of agency is distinct from actual control and can be present or absent independently of whether you're actually causing events. Sometimes you feel agency when you're not really in control, and sometimes you lack a sense of agency even when you're controlling your actions. The theory suggests that agency is constructed by the brain based on cues like the timing between intentions and actions, the predictability of outcomes, and the absence of external forces. When these cues align properly, you experience agency. When they don't, you may feel like a passive observer of your own actions. Disorders of agency can lead to experiences where actions feel involuntary, or where you feel responsible for events you didn't cause. Your sense of being an agent, of being able to make things happen, might be one more constructed feature of consciousness, a model the brain creates to help you navigate the world. The theory suggests that agency is not a direct perception of causation, but an inference, a best guess based on available information. The mind might create a sense of continuity across interruptions in consciousness. This theory proposes that your sense of being the same person who went to sleep last night requires the brain to bridge gaps in consciousness, creating continuity where there are actually breaks. Every night, consciousness ceases during deep sleep, yet you wake feeling like the same person, with no sense of discontinuity. The brain must reconstruct continuity each morning, linking current consciousness to memories of previous consciousness, creating the illusion of unbroken existence. The theory suggests that personal identity over time is not a given but an achievement, something the brain actively maintains. If consciousness is discontinuous, then in what sense are you the same person who existed yesterday? The theory proposes that continuity is created through memory and narrative, with your current self claiming ownership of past selves through remembering and storytelling. This means personal identity might be more fragile than it seems, dependent on brain processes that maintain the illusion of continuity. Your sense of being a continuous self, existing through time, might be one more construction, one more story the brain tells itself to make sense of its own operation. Consciousness might be necessary for certain types of learning, but not others. This theory proposes that some learning can occur unconsciously without awareness, while other types require consciousness. Simple associations and procedural skills might be learned without consciousness, but complex conceptual learning and explicit memory formation might require awareness. The theory suggests that consciousness serves a specific function in learning. It allows information to be flexibly combined and recombined, enabling generalization and transfer to new situations. Unconscious learning tends to be more rigid, tied to specific contexts and difficult to apply in novel ways. This would explain why consciousness evolved. It provides a learning advantage, allowing organisms to adapt more quickly to changing environments. Your conscious experiences might be particularly important for learning, with awareness serving to consolidate memories and integrate new information with existing knowledge. The theory implies that consciousness is not just a passive observer, but plays an active role in shaping what you learn and remember. Without consciousness, learning would be possible but limited, lacking the flexibility and generalization that make human cognition so powerful. The mind might construct a narrative self, while also experiencing a more immediate pre-reflective awareness. This theory proposes that consciousness has two layers: a basic awareness of present experience and a more elaborate narrative self that interprets and contextualizes that experience. The narrative self is the one that tells stories, makes plans, and worries about the future, while pre-reflective awareness is simpler, more immediate, less conceptual. Some meditation practices aim to quiet the narrative self and rest in pre-reflective awareness, suggesting these are separable aspects of consciousness. The theory suggests that much of what people identify as consciousness is actually the narrative layer, while the deeper layer of awareness often goes unnoticed. Your sense of being a person with a history and future might be constructed by the narrative self, while your immediate experience of colours, sounds, and sensations might be pre-reflective. The theory implies that consciousness is not monolithic but contains different levels or modes, with the narrative mode being more recent evolutionarily and more vulnerable to disruption. In certain states, deep meditation, flow, or intense present moment focus, the narrative self might fade, leaving only pre-reflective awareness, a form of consciousness without self-consciousness. Consciousness might be fundamentally mysterious, resistant to complete scientific explanation. This theory, sometimes called Mysterianism, proposes that human minds might lack the cognitive capacity to fully understand consciousness, just as a dog cannot understand quantum mechanics. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining why physical processes give rise to subjective experience, might be unsolvable, not because we haven't found the right answer yet, but because the answer lies beyond human comprehension. The theory doesn't suggest that consciousness is supernatural or non-physical, only that it might involve principles or properties that human cognition cannot grasp. This would be a limitation of our minds, not a limitation of science in general. The theory is controversial because it seems to give up on explanation, but proponents argue it's simply honest about cognitive limitations. Your consciousness might be explicable in principle, but not by you, not by any human, because understanding it would require concepts or ways of thinking that human brains cannot achieve. The mystery might be permanent, not because consciousness is magical, but because human understanding has boundaries. The theory offers a kind of epistemic humility, acknowledging that some questions might forever remain beyond our reach, beautiful and strange and ultimately inexplicable. The mind might create meaning through embodied simulation, recreating experiences and neural systems. This theory proposes that understanding language and concepts involves simulating the relevant experiences in sensory and motor systems. When you read about running, your motor cortex partially activates as if you were running. When you read about coffee, your olfactory system partially activates as if you were smelling it. Meaning would not be abstract and disembodied, but grounded in simulations of perception and action. This would explain why thinking about actions can improve performance, why mental imagery can affect the body, and why understanding requires more than just processing words. The theory suggests that consciousness is inherently imaginative, constantly creating internal simulations of possible experiences. Your thoughts might involve weak activations of the same systems used for actual perception and action, creating a kind of virtual experience. This would make consciousness fundamentally embodied, dependent on having a body and sensory systems to simulate. The theory implies that meaning is created through reenactment, with understanding requiring the ability to recreate relevant experiences internally, even if only partially and fleetingly. Consciousness might involve integration across time, binding moments together into experiences with duration. This theory proposes that consciousness doesn't exist in instantaneous moments, but requires integration over brief time windows, typically a few hundred milliseconds. What you experience as now actually spans a short duration, with the brain integrating information across this window to create unified experiences. Events that fall within the same integration window seem simultaneous, while events separated by longer intervals are perceived as sequential. The theory explains why consciousness has a temporal thickness, why the present moment feels extended rather than knife-edge thin. It also explains certain temporal illusions, where the order of events can be misperceived if they fall within the same integration window. Your experience of time might be fundamentally chunky rather than smooth, divided into discrete moments of integration, though these moments overlap and blend to create the impression of continuity. The theory suggests that consciousness is not just spatial integration of information across the brain, but temporal integration across brief intervals, binding past and present into a unified now. This temporal binding might be essential to consciousness, with awareness requiring not just information but information integrated across time. The mind might be fundamentally relational, defined by connections rather than intrinsic properties. This theory proposes that consciousness is not a thing that exists independently, but a pattern of relationships, a web of connections between mental states, brain states, and the environment. What makes a mental state conscious might not be any intrinsic property it possesses, but how it relates to other states, how it's integrated into the larger network of mental activity. This would mean consciousness is context-dependent, varying based on what else is happening in the mind and brain. The theory challenges the assumption that consciousness can be located in specific brain regions or processes, suggesting instead that it emerges from relationships between regions and processes. Your conscious experience at any moment would reflect the entire pattern of neural activity, not just activity in particular areas. The theory implies that consciousness is holistic, that the whole is not just more than but different from the sum of its parts. Studying isolated components might never reveal consciousness, because consciousness exists only in the relationships, in the patterns of connection and interaction that can't be reduced to individual elements. The theory suggests that consciousness is fundamentally systemic, existing at the level of the whole brain rather than in any particular part. Consciousness might require a certain temporal coherence, with neural activity synchronized across regions. This theory proposes that consciousness arises when different brain regions oscillate in synchrony, their neural activity coordinated in time. This synchronization might bind information across regions, creating unified experiences from distributed processing. When synchrony breaks down, consciousness fragments or fades. The theory explains why certain brain rhythms, like gamma oscillations, correlate with consciousness. These rhythms provide the temporal framework for binding. It also explains why anesthetics disrupt consciousness. They interfere with neural synchronization, preventing regions from communicating effectively. Your conscious experience might depend on billions of neurons firing in coordinated patterns, their activity aligned in time to create coherence. The theory suggests that consciousness is not just about which neurons fire, but when they fire, with timing being crucial for creating unified awareness. This temporal coordination might be what allows the brain to solve the binding problem, integrating color, shape, motion, and other features into coherent objects. Without synchrony, you might perceive features but not objects, sensations but not scenes, a world of disconnected fragments rather than unified experience. The mind might construct a model of other minds, enabling social understanding. This theory proposes that consciousness includes the ability to represent others as having minds like your own, with beliefs, desires, and intentions. This theory of mind might be essential to human consciousness, shaping how you understand yourself by seeing yourself as others see you. The ability to model other minds might require consciousness, or might be what makes consciousness distinctly human. The theory suggests that your sense of self is partly social, constructed through interactions and shaped by how you imagine others perceive you. Children develop theory of mind around age 4, suggesting it's not innate but learned, and individuals with autism often have difficulty with it, suggesting it depends on specific neural systems. Your consciousness might be inherently social, structured by the need to navigate a world of other minds. The theory implies that solitary consciousness might be fundamentally different from social consciousness, that being aware in the presence of others involves additional layers of awareness of their awareness of you, recursive loops of mutual modeling. Human consciousness might be uniquely social, shaped by millions of years of evolution in social groups where understanding others was essential to survival. Consciousness might involve a sense of nowness, of being in the present moment. This theory proposes that awareness includes not just experiences, but a fundamental sense that these experiences are happening now, not in the past or future. This nowness is distinct from the content of experience and can be present or absent independently of what you're experiencing. Sometimes you're fully present, absorbed in the moment. Other times you're mentally elsewhere, caught up in memories or plans. The theory suggests that nowness requires attention to be focused on current experience rather than wandering to other times. Meditation practices often aim to cultivate nowness, suggesting it's not automatic but must be maintained through effort. Your sense of being in the present might be one more constructed feature, something the brain creates by tagging experiences with temporal information. The theory implies that consciousness can exist in different temporal modes, sometimes anchored in the present, sometimes drifting through past and future. Full presence might be rare, with most of your waking life spent partly elsewhere, your mind wandering through time while your body remains in the present. The theory suggests that nowness is a dimension of consciousness that can vary independently of other dimensions, making some moments more vivid and real than others. The mind might be capable of meta-awareness, of being aware that it's aware. This theory proposes that consciousness has levels, with basic awareness being distinct from awareness of awareness. You can be conscious without being conscious that you're conscious, experiencing things without reflecting on the fact that you're experiencing them. Meta-awareness might be a higher order function, present only in humans and perhaps some other animals, requiring additional neural machinery beyond what's needed for basic consciousness. The theory suggests that much of animal consciousness might lack meta-awareness, consisting of experiences without self-reflection. Even human consciousness might often lack meta-awareness, with reflection being intermittent rather than constant. When you're absorbed in an activity, you might be conscious without being meta-aware, fully engaged but not reflecting on your engagement. The theory implies that consciousness is not all or nothing but comes in degrees and varieties, with meta-awareness being one dimension, along which consciousness can vary. Your ability to know that you know, to be aware that you're aware, might be what makes human consciousness distinctive, enabling language, culture, and the kind of self-understanding that allows you to ponder consciousness itself. Consciousness might be shaped by expectations in ways that go beyond perception. This theory proposes that your entire experience is filtered through expectations, with consciousness reflecting not just what is but what you expect to be. These expectations operate at every level, from basic perception to complex thought, shaping what you notice, how you interpret ambiguous information, and what you remember. The theory suggests that consciousness is fundamentally predictive, always leaning forward into anticipated futures, always comparing current experience to expected experience. This makes consciousness inherently subjective, because different expectations lead to different experiences of the same objective situation. Two people can witness identical events, yet have radically different conscious experiences because they bring different expectations. The theory explains why it's so difficult to see the world objectively, why biases are so persistent, and why changing minds is so hard. Because consciousness is structured by expectations that resist disconfirmation. Your experience right now is shaped by countless expectations you're not even aware of having. Predictions so automatic and pervasive that they're invisible, yet they colour everything you perceive and think. The theory suggests that consciousness is less like a window on reality, and more like a lens that bends and filters everything passing through it. The mind might construct a sense of free will, even if choices are determined. This theory proposes that the feeling of freely choosing is generated by the brain, regardless of whether free will actually exists in a metaphysical sense. Your sense of agency and control might be useful fictions, created to help you navigate the world and learn from experience, but not accurate representations of how decisions are actually made. The theory doesn't necessarily deny free will, but suggests that the conscious experience of choosing might be constructed after the fact. A narrative the brain tells itself about decisions that were already made by unconscious processes. This would explain why brain activity predicts choices before conscious awareness of deciding, why the sense of agency can be manipulated experimentally, and why people often confabulate reasons for choices they don't actually understand. Your feeling of being in control might be one more illusion, a useful one that promotes learning and responsibility, but not necessarily true. The theory raises profound questions about moral responsibility. If the sense of free will is constructed, does that change how we should think about praise and blame? The mystery of free will might be less about whether it exists, and more about why we feel so certain that it does. Consciousness might require a balance between integration and differentiation in the brain. This theory proposes that awareness depends on the brain being both unified and diverse, with different regions maintaining distinct functions while also communicating effectively. Too much integration would lead to uniformity, with all regions doing the same thing, unable to represent different aspects of experience. Too much differentiation would lead to fragmentation, with regions operating independently, unable to create unified consciousness. The theory suggests that consciousness exists in the sweet spot between these extremes, where the brain is maximally both integrated and differentiated. This balance might be what allows consciousness to be both unified and rich, both coherent and complex. The theory offers a mathematical framework for measuring this balance, suggesting that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information that is also differentiated. Your conscious experience might reflect the particular balance your brain achieves between unity and diversity, with different mental states corresponding to different points along this spectrum. The theory implies that consciousness is not just about information processing, but about the structure of that processing, the way information is both shared and separated across the brain. The mind might be fundamentally incomplete, unable to fully represent itself. This theory proposes that consciousness cannot be completely self-aware, because the act of being aware requires resources that cannot simultaneously be used to be aware of being aware, leading to an infinite regress. Your consciousness can reflect on itself, but this reflection is always partial, always missing something, because the reflecting process itself remains outside awareness. This would mean that complete self-knowledge is impossible in principle, not just in practice. The theory suggests that consciousness is like an eye that cannot see itself seeing, a system that can represent many things but cannot completely represent its own operation. This incompleteness might be fundamental to consciousness, not a limitation that could be overcome with better introspection or more sophisticated thought. Your sense of self, your understanding of your own mind must always be incomplete, always missing the processes that create the understanding itself. The theory offers a kind of epistemic humility, acknowledging that consciousness contains depths that consciousness itself cannot plumb, mysteries that remain mysterious not because they're supernatural, but because the act of knowing cannot fully encompass itself. The mind might be forever partially opaque to itself, knowable but never fully known. Consciousness might involve a sense of reality, of experiences being real rather than imagined. This theory proposes that awareness includes not just experiences, but a quality of realness that distinguishes perception from imagination, memory from fantasy. This sense of reality is distinct from the content of experience and can vary independently. Sometimes imagined events feel real, and sometimes real events feel unreal. The theory suggests that the brain tags experiences with a reality marker, indicating whether they should be treated as actual or merely possible. Disorders like schizophrenia might involve disruptions to this tagging process, leading to hallucinations that feel as real as perceptions. Dreams feel real while you're dreaming, but shift to feeling unreal upon waking, suggesting the reality tag can be updated retrospectively. Your sense that your current experience is real, that you're awake and perceiving an actual world, might be one more constructed feature. A judgment the brain makes based on cues like sensory coherence, consistency with expectations, and the presence of appropriate neural activity. The theory implies that reality is not directly perceived but inferred, with consciousness always involving an implicit judgment about whether experiences should be trusted as veridical or dismissed as mere imagination. The mind might be shaped by the body's needs and states in fundamental ways. This theory proposes that consciousness is not separate from bodily needs, but deeply intertwined with them, with awareness serving fundamentally to regulate the body and maintain homeostasis. Emotions, motivations, and even thoughts might be shaped by bodily states like hunger, fatigue, temperature, and pain. The theory suggests that consciousness evolved primarily to manage the body's needs, with more abstract cognitive functions being later additions built on this foundation. Your conscious experience at any moment might be coloured by subtle bodily signals you're not explicitly aware of, with mood and thought patterns shifting based on physiological state. The theory explains why physical states affect mental states so profoundly, why exercise improves mood, why hunger makes you irritable, and why illness changes how you think. Consciousness might be fundamentally embodied, not in the sense of being implemented in a body, but in the sense of being about the body, serving the body's needs. The theory implies that understanding consciousness requires understanding physiology, that mind and body are not separate domains but aspects of a single integrated system. Your consciousness might be less like a ghost in a machine, and more like the machine's way of monitoring and regulating itself. Consciousness might involve a sense of effort, of mental work being done. This theory proposes that awareness includes not just passive reception, but a felt quality of effort, of attention being directed and maintained through work. This effort is not just metaphorical, but corresponds to actual metabolic costs, with conscious processing requiring energy and creating fatigue. The theory suggests that consciousness is not effortless, but requires active maintenance, with attention being a limited resource that must be allocated carefully. When you concentrate on something difficult, the feeling of effort might reflect real neural work, real energy being expended to maintain focus. The theory explains why thinking can be tiring, why attention wanders when you're fatigued, and why some mental tasks feel harder than others. Your sense of mental effort might be the brain's way of monitoring its own resource use, providing feedback about how much energy is being spent on conscious processing. The theory implies that consciousness is not just a state, but an activity, something the brain does rather than something it has. The subjective experience of effort might be essential to consciousness, distinguishing active engagement from passive drift, focused attention from mind wandering. The mind might construct a sense of depth, of experiences having layers and complexity. This theory proposes that consciousness is not flat but dimensional, with experiences having foreground and background, focus and periphery, surface and depth. This sense of depth is distinct from the content of experience and adds a structural quality to awareness. The theory suggests that consciousness involves not just what you're aware of, but how you're aware of it, with attention creating gradients of clarity and vividness. Some experiences stand out while others recede, creating a landscape of consciousness with peaks and valleys. This depth might be essential to normal awareness, with flat consciousness being impoverished or abnormal. The theory explains why attention feels like a spotlight, illuminating some things while leaving others in shadow, and why consciousness has a limited capacity, because only so much can be in the foreground at once. Your experience right now has depth, with some elements vivid and clear while others are vague and peripheral, creating a rich, layered structure. The theory implies that consciousness is not just about having experiences, but about organizing them in space, creating a phenomenal landscape with its own geography and topology. consciousness might be fundamentally creative, generating novelty rather than just processing information. This theory proposes that awareness is not passive but active, not just receiving but creating, with consciousness adding something new to the universe rather than merely reflecting what's already there. Your thoughts might be genuinely novel, not just recombinations of existing elements, but creative acts that bring new patterns into existence. The theory suggests that consciousness is a source of novelty, a generator of possibilities, a creative force in the universe. This creativity might be what makes consciousness valuable, what justifies its metabolic cost and evolutionary persistence. A purely mechanical system might process information efficiently, but would lack the creative spark that consciousness provides. The theory implies that consciousness is not reducible to computation because computation is deterministic, following fixed rules, while consciousness is creative, capable of genuine innovation. Your ability to imagine, to dream, to think thoughts no one has thought before, might be the essence of consciousness, the feature that makes it irreducible to mere information processing. The theory suggests that consciousness is not just about knowing, but about creating, about bringing new meanings and possibilities into existence through the act of awareness itself. Consciousness might involve a sense of intimacy, of direct acquaintance with experience. This theory proposes that awareness includes not just information about things, but a sense of being directly in touch with them, of knowing them intimately rather than merely knowing about them. This intimacy is what makes consciousness subjective, what creates the qualitative feel of experience that seems irreducible to objective description. The theory suggests that consciousness is fundamentally first-personal, involving a kind of a knowledge that cannot be fully communicated or shared. When you see red, you have intimate acquaintance with redness, a direct knowing that goes beyond any description or explanation. This intimacy might be what makes consciousness mysterious, what creates the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. The theory implies that consciousness is not just about processing information, but about being present with it, about having a kind of direct contact that third-person science cannot capture. Your experience right now has this intimate quality, a sense of being directly in touch with your thoughts and perceptions, knowing them from the inside in a way that no external observer could. The theory suggests that this intimacy is essential to consciousness, that awareness without it would be something different, perhaps not consciousness at all, but mere information processing. The mind might be fundamentally open, never fully determined or closed. This theory proposes that consciousness is not a fixed system, but an open-ended process, constantly evolving, never complete, always capable of surprise and novelty. Your consciousness right now is not the final version, but a moment in an ongoing development, with new capacities and forms of awareness potentially emerging throughout life. The theory suggests that consciousness is not just about what is, but about what could be, about possibilities and potentials that remain unrealized. This openness might be what makes consciousness creative and flexible, what allows learning and growth, what makes each moment genuinely new rather than just a repetition of the past. The theory implies that consciousness cannot be fully explained by past causes because it's always reaching toward future possibilities, always open to novelty that cannot be predicted from what came before. Your consciousness is not just a product of your brain and history, but an ongoing creative process, making itself up as it goes along, never finished, never closed, always open to new forms and possibilities. The theory offers a vision of consciousness as fundamentally free, not in the sense of being uncaused, but in the sense of being open, incomplete, and endlessly creative. And so, our quiet journey through the mind's inner universe comes to a gentle close. We've travelled far tonight, from the emergence of consciousness in complexity to the open-ended creativity of awareness itself, touching on questions that have puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. The theories behind us now are like stars fading into dawn. Some theories offered answers, others only deeper questions. Some felt solid, others shimmered like mirages. But all of them carried a piece of humanity's endless curiosity, our refusal to accept the mind at face value, our need to wonder about the very awareness that allows us to wonder. These theories, some ancient and some born yesterday, represent our attempts to understand the strangest thing in the universe, the fact that the universe can be aware of itself, that matter can wake up and look around and ask what it is. Theories are strange things. They're not quite facts, not quite fantasies. They live in the space between what we know and what we imagine. They're humanity's way of reaching toward truth with imperfect hands, building bridges across chasms of ignorance. Some will be proven right, others will fade, but the reaching itself, the wondering, never stops. The mind continues to study itself, consciousness turning back to examine consciousness, an infinite mirror reflecting into depths we cannot yet fathom. If your eyes are already heavy, that's just fine. Perfect, even. Let the last traces of neural networks and temporal integration fade behind your thoughts, becoming less distinct, less important. Let your breath carry you softly into rest, each exhale releasing a little more tension, each inhale drawing you deeper into calm. There's still so much more to discover, endless theories waiting, but for now, you've learned enough. You've wondered enough. You've travelled far through mysteries and questions, and the mind's inner universe can wait until morning, patient and unchanging, ready whenever you return. The theories will still be there, the questions will still wait, consciousness will still be strange and beautiful and inexplicable. You don't need to remember any of this. Not the names, not the details, not even the theories themselves. They were never meant to be memorized, only experienced, like watching clouds drift across the sky. What matters is not what you retain, but how you felt while listening, the gentle stimulation of curiosity, the soft pleasure of learning, the quiet comfort of questions asked in darkness. That's enough. That's everything. Your mind has been active, engaged, exploring its own nature, and now it's time to let that activity settle, to let the questions dissolve into sleep. Notice how your body has grown heavier as we've talked, how your muscles have softened, how even the weight of your thoughts has decreased. This is the natural rhythm of rest, the way consciousness gradually releases its grip, letting you drift. You don't need to force it. You don't need to try. Just allow it, the way you'd allow yourself to float in calm water, trusting the water to hold you, trusting the darkness to be safe. Your consciousness has been working, processing, wondering, and now it's ready to rest, to fade into the background, to let sleep take over. There's nothing you need to do now, no answers to chase, no puzzles to solve, no theories to understand. Just the calm certainty that mystery itself is a kind of lullaby, one that will carry you into sleep. So let go. Let your mind wander where it will, through dreams or darkness, through memories or nothing at all. Let the questions fade. Let the theories dissolve. Let consciousness itself grow dim and distant. Thank you for spending this time with me, for letting me guide you through these theories, these questions, these mysteries about the mind's inner universe. Thank you for your curiosity, for your willingness to wonder, for choosing to end your day with learning rather than emptiness. It means something, this choice you've made. It says something about who you are, someone who seeks understanding even in the quiet moments before sleep, someone who finds peace in questions that have no easy answers, and I'm grateful to be part of your evening, part of your routine, part of the quiet ritual that carries you from waking into sleep. You're not alone in this. Right now, all across the world, others are listening too, drifting through these same theories, wondering these same questions about consciousness and mind. Some are ahead of you, already deep in dreams. Others are just beginning. But you're all connected by this shared experience, this common journey through mystery and wonder, a quiet community of curious minds seeking rest and knowledge in the same breath, finding peace in questions that have no answers. You're part of something larger, a collective wondering that spans cultures and centuries, all of us puzzling over the same mystery. What is it like to be aware, to be conscious, to be a mind in a world of matter? Imagine yourself now, floating through the theories we've explored, passing by them as if through constellations in the night. Questions above, questions below, a galaxy of wonder all around you. And you at the quiet centre, resting in the knowledge that mystery is not something to fear, but something to embrace, that not knowing is not failure, but invitation, that the mind keeps secrets from itself not to frustrate us, but to keep us curious, to keep us reaching, to keep us human. Let that thought comfort you. Let it wrap around you like a blanket woven from starlight and uncertainty, soft and strange and somehow perfect. The theories we've explored tonight are just whispers in an infinite conversation, questions asked across time, mysteries that connect us all. There's nothing left to do now, no answers to chase, no puzzles to solve, no theories to understand. Just the calm certainty that mystery itself is a kind of lullaby, one that will carry you into sleep. So let go. Let your mind wander where it will, through dreams or darkness, through memories or nothing at all. Let your consciousness dim like a sunset, gradually, naturally, beautifully. And know that when you wake, the theories will still be here, the questions will still wait, and the mind's inner universe will still be strange and wonderful, still full of mysteries waiting to be explored. I hope you sleep well and dream softly. May your rest be deep, your dreams be gentle, and your tomorrow be bright. Thank you for being here. Good night.